On April 17, 2017, in Russia, during the plenary session of the Fourth Media Forum of Independent Regional and Local Media, Trust and Justice, Russian President Vladimir Putin was asked who will be the first to fly to Mars, to which he replied, "The machine." Why? Because everyone is planning flights to Mars, but few people know that in today's condition, in existing spaceship, a living cell is unlikely to fly there. She's just going to be defenseless in front of hard space. Nevertheless, everything is changing and soon such opportunities will appear, but for now it's necessary to recognize that there are problems. Therefore, in the near future, research will still be carried out using technology, he explained. Any sane person immediately raised the question, what about flying to the moon? After all, human foot has repeatedly stepped on the surface of the satellite of our planet. Let's try to figure it out. It happened almost 50 years ago, on July 16, 1969, when the sensational news about the man's coming to the moon's surface flew around the Earth. NASA regularly published press releases and bulletins. Experts and astronauts gave numerous interviews. Many countries in the world scientific community participated in the technical support. Tens of thousands of people watched the UPS of Hoax rockets, and millions watched a live TV broadcast from space. On Earth's broad lunar soil, international scientific conferences were held to understand the data that came from the devices left on the moon. But years later they began to hush up about the event, and it turned out that this fact is not as unambiguous and transparent as it seemed in those distant times of cosmic romanticism. Some facts became known that don't fit into the big picture and caused deep doubts about the lunar achievements of the NASA. Already in the 1970s, that's even before the completion of the lunar program, published a brochure by James Craney, Did Man Land on the Moon?, behind which, like an avalanche, the facts exposing the flight to the moon began to fall. For example, Bill Kaysing in the book We Never Went to the Moon argued that the rocket Saturn V technical fake and could never send astronauts in interplanetary flight, so in reality Apollo flew around the Earth and the television was broadcast using unmanned aerial vehicles. Of course, part of the arguments of supporters of the lunar conspiracy find a well-founded refutation. For example, it has long been hackneyed, fluttering in the wind, the stars and stripes are just an illusion. Ripples on the surface of the canvas isn't caused by the wind, but by damped oscillations that occurred during the installation. If you look at the video, such fluctuations occur not only the flags, many other objects too long swing after they were touched by astronauts. Nevertheless, you must agree, the abundance of facts that do not fit and require refutation already speaks for itself and suggests that with lunar flights not everything is as smooth as it is presented to us by official sources. Let's go back to 1968, the same year when on December 21, Apollo 8 went to the first manned flight to the moon after the second test of the Saturn V rocket, which turned out to be a failure. What do you think? Could NASA go on such an adventure? It was then on Earth the events that are one of the keys to unraveling lunar expedition. In those days, 700 employees of the center received notifications of temporary dismissal. It took another 2 years. By January 1970, NASA had already announced 5 successful launches of manned spacecraft Apollo, and the basis of all the success was the rocket Saturn V. And at this very time, the permanent director of the center, chief designer of many missiles and space system, chief designer of the Saturn V rocket, Werner von Braun, is dismissed and removed from the leadership of missile developments. And not temporarily, but forever. Isn't that a very interesting piece of information? As for missile itself, there are even more questions that remain unanswered. If NASA really could, in the mid-60s, to create such a powerful oxygen-kerosene engine as F1, Saturn V had 5 of them, then why they were replaced by even more advanced shuttles that did not avoid explosion time after time and require 6 times more flights, and therefore financial costs to bring an equal amount of cargo into orbit of the Earth, and why in the late 19th the American government turned to Russia with a request to sell them almost twice less powerful RD-180, also working on oxygen and kerosene. Already modern experts say that the 3 stages of Saturn V worked on kerosene, which means that the astronauts could at best only fly around the moon on a manned spacecraft and drop to the surface of the satellite, at times a reduced layout of the lunar module, but not to bring into orbit a full module. By the way, the creation of Saturn took a huge amount of money, taking into account inflation from $32 to $45 billion. Isn't this a confirmation that Saturn V was actually a flying rattle, the purpose of which was to create the impression of a super powerful carrier, allegedly able to deliver people to the moon? This assumption is reinforced by the fact that none of the foreign astronauts on board was or worked on the Skylab space station that they put into orbit. After the completion of the lunar program, the equipment wasn't used for its intended purpose. It was simply sent to the museum. From the Soviet scientists who were engaged in space developments, anybody a lot did not express thoughts about the veracity of the lunar flights, in addition to General Designa Mishin, who replaced the post of Sergei Korolev. During a live report from the start of Apollo, Mishin smoked all the time and repeated, "It's impossible. Apollo will not be able to break away from Earth's orbit and go to the moon." I think I knew what I was saying. But then the cheerful voice of the American commentator said, "Apollo came down from Earth's orbit and goes to the moon." Mishin couldn't understand anything, got up, went out, slamming the door. Meanwhile, on the morning of July 16, 1969, when Apollo 11 went to the moon, several Soviet ships banked near Cape Canaveral in the Atlantic watched the takeoff of Saturn V. However, American warship and patrol aircraft Orion tried to create electronic interference. Therefore, they tried to hide some important fact. Do not exclude the fact that Saturn V just didn't go into orbit and fell into the ocean. Just think about it. For 12 years of the program, NASA was able to 6 times out of 7 to land astronauts on the moon and bring them back. There wasn't a single misfire and no serious trouble. Owning such an incredible successful statistic, which promises a fabulous profit from the production of helium-3 on the moon, the NASA foolishly buried this project, never to return to it. What do you think is the reason? Well, seriously, in 1969 there was such technology as the money was to fly to the moon, back, computers were to calculate all the risks of flight, to create materials, module, probes, rovers, and now there is no possibility sharply. Can you name another technology that can step backwards? Computers, nanorobots, the internet, smartphones, electric cars, yes, a lot of complex and interesting things have been created and successfully developed, but with lunar flights is not glued in any way. For 49 years, no country in the world has been able to repeat the unprecedented success that the Americans were able to achieve. However, it turns out that they themselves can't afford. And now let's go back to the statement of the Russian President Vladimir Putin about space flights and try to explain it. Flight astronauts discovered in 1958 a radiation belt Van Allen. On Earth, streams of deadly solar radiation for humans are restrained by the magnetosphere, and in its absence, the ship would need effective radiation protection. NASA machines did not have simulators of the Earth's magnetic field. How can you send people to the moon if the day before from space returned mortally irradiated for 9 days in orbit and died of dehydration and heart attack male macaques? Radiation is one of the main obstacles in space exploration. For this reason, even today, all manned flights pass no more than 500 kilometers from the surface of our planet, where astronauts are protected by radiation belts and partially discharge atmosphere of the planet, which is still present at these heights. But the Moon, unlike the Earth, does not have its radiation belts. For this reason, and in manned spacecraft and spacesuit on the lunar surface, the astronauts had to get a lethal dose of radiation. However, they all returned to Earth alive. In fact, all that technology is capable of today in 2018 is to send robots, probes, equipment, only not living devices into space to a height above 1,000 kilometers from the Earth's surface. The health of astronauts after landing and spent 8 days in weightlessness for the first time is highly suspicious. Brave, fresh and smiling, and already without spacesuits, such astronauts appeared right after a fly before cameras or journalists, and in 50 minutes they cheerfully participated in the meeting devoted to return to the Earth. Here is a testimony of Russian professionals from a group of search and rescue of astronauts. The picture after landing is as follows. The approximated state of the astronaut is as if a man ran a 30 kilometers cross and then a few hours riding on the carousel. Disturbed coordination, disturbed vestibular apparatus. So close to landing, the distant apparatus mandatory unfold a mobile hospital. Immediately upon landing, we check the astronaut's head system, pressure, pulse, the amount of oxygen in the blood. The astronauts are transported in a prone position. In other words, if the astronauts have been in Earth's orbit for at least a few days, then in the first hours after they return, they are in a state of extreme fatigue and are practically unable to move independently. Stretcher and hospital bed that they fade in the coming days. That's how real astronauts come back from Earth's orbit. By the way, none of the Apollo had toilets. Diapers were used instead. For almost 9 days it should have been 15 kilograms of natural waste for each, at least. Well, when did they have time to wash all this organic matter? Another stroke in the continuation of theme, the capsule enters the dense layers of the atmosphere at a speed many times higher than the speed of sound. All the energy of the incoming air flows tunes into head, and the temperature in the hottest place at the bottom of the device reaches several thousand degrees. Now compare, we have two lander, Russian and American lunar. Do you believe both machines were in space? Why terminal protection on the device is melted and other device shines like new? Again deception? Probably capsule Apollo just dropped by parachute aircraft. Hence the almost its original sparking look. In the previously mentioned book, We Never Been to the Moon, Casing says, during one of my talk shows, a flight plane pilot called and reported that he saw the Apollo capsule being dropped from a large plane, around the time astronauts were supposed to return from the Moon. 7 passengers, the Japanese, have seen this case. A separate word dissolves the accuracy of landing splashdown. Gagarin during landing carried away to the side for hundreds of kilometers. It's almost a day looking for the helicopters. And then hitting wasn't much closer. But precision landing American return capsule was 2 to 15 kilometers. Amazing results. And only by the end of 18th, scientists have found out that landing with an accuracy above 40 kilometers is unattainable. But nobody knew that in the 60s. As already mentioned, from the surface of the Moon, astronauts were delivered lunar soil and stones, a total of 382 kilograms. Yes, automatic space station to collect and deliver to Earth such a number of soil samples can't afford. Then why, when the NASA were offered to exchange samples for research, those almost 3 years pulled and only in 1972 gave the Russians as much as 3 grams? Skeptics claim that it was then, finally, to the moon secretly flew automatic station Sequoia and brought the same grams of moon powder. As a result, the NASA gave the Russian 28 grams of regolith lunar sand, which the Soviet automatic station together delivered about 300 grams. Well, the most interesting thing in this story is that, preparing for the 40th anniversary of the landing on the moon, NASA suddenly discovered the loss of original film materials with footage of astronauts landing. It will seem that such films are not only a fact of pride of Americans, but also the heritage of all mankind. How could this happen? That just wasn't the original footage from the moon. Supposedly, this proves that part of moonshots were made in the House of Hollywood. The first Hollywood film about the moon landing was shown in 1968. This is Stanley Kubrick's 2001 Space Odyssey. It shows such things as deep space, interplanetary station, spacecraft flights, view of Earth from space, landing on the moon, movements of people in weightlessness. At the same time, all the time filming advised Kubrick best experts from NASA. The film is recognized as the best fantastic in the history of cinema. In the dry residue we have a great professional experience in creating special effects for Hollywood, a ready base for filming and editing after the 2001 Space Odyssey. Plus we have real rockets, real modules that NASA developed for its space programs. I left them to join together and get the movie 1969 about landing astronauts on the moon. Moreover, in the network you can easily find an interview with Stanley Kubrick, which he gave not long before his death, in which the director admits that by order of NASA imitated in the shooting pavilion some alleged episodes of astronauts on the moon. But there is no evil intent here, just NASA wasn't sure that the TV program from the surface of our satellite will be of high enough quality to give viewers the idea of what the astronauts are doing there. Here the agency and re-established on Earth what was going to happen on the moon. In addition to the above, recently it became quite obvious that the surface of the moon has a pronounced brown tint, which is confirmed by a color image from Soviet and China's lunar rovers. The NASA hasn't provided a single shot of brown soil. But most importantly, no one knew that only after some 30 years there will be an all-powerful Photoshop, when with its help lunar photos added maximum brightness and contrast. Instead of the absolute black sky, in the picture appeared scenery which clearly became visible strip of light from the searchlights and shadows from the astronauts. Why did it take the deception a planetary scale, the implementation of which took enormous funds on throughout the United States could go to raise the self-rating in terms of like in the space race from the Soviet Union? Then why the USSR did not expose this deception? Everything is simple. It was profitable for the Soviet Union. You don't know when the supply of oil and gas from USSR to Europe began. You want more matches? Lunar Program 1961 to 1975, landing July 1969. The start of gas from the USSR to Europe 1968, plus the 1973 oil crisis. Super profits are flowing. Do you need to explain what oil and gas sales are for the USSR? It was and remains the main source of foreign exchange earnings of the USSR Russia. Now you understand that the Soviet Union received for this silence about the lunar landing. But before the current head of the Russian state, a direct question about the stay of Americans on the moon was first put in December 2012 at the conference of the President of the Russian Federation, Putin, at which everyone could ask the question to interest were asked in writing, whether Americans on the moon or not. The question wasn't heard on the air, but sometime later an answer was received from Roscosmos, signed by the Chief Scientific Secretary Milovanov. Roscosmos doesn't have information confirming your point of view regarding the landing of Americans on the moon. Is this a banal answer, or Roscosmos also hides the truth? This idea is suggested by another fact. The exit a quick refutation of the words of the head of Roscosmos, Dmitry Rogozin, who offered to check whether there were Americans on the moon. He spoke about this during a visit to the Russian space system company on November 24 at 12:44 p.m. I quote the words of Rogozin verbatim: "We set such a task to fly to check. They were or were not. They say they were, we will check." No sooner had Rogozin threatened to check the fact of flight to the moon, as Roscosmos declared his words a joke. By the way, the refutation came out in 13 hours at 1:55 a.m. night in Russia and in the USA day. Apparently, the refutation was given first of all not for citizens of Russia, but rather for partners of Roscosmos in the USA. New opportunities developed modern technology increasingly point to lunar out of fantasy. For this kind of expeditions, the main evidence of their authenticity in the presence of photo and film documents, most of which, when examined in detail, turned out to be fake. I think, and most viewers will agree with me, if there was a fraud in at least one fragment, there is a good reason to question all the flights of Apollo. In addition, in order to put an end to the story, we can only be patient and wait for people to be ready to fly to the moon again. The only question is who and when will fly there. The Americans themselves will revive their lunar program, or maybe it will be China, India or Russia.